Well, he created a national security memorandum, for example, that viewed people that live in the third world birth rates and in the global South as national security threats to the United States, and wanted to implement policies to reduce their population size, for example. Whoa. And sort of had what I would argue was a eugenicist bent to some of his policies. And he was one of the mentors, of course, to people that have become infamous in recent years, like the World Economic Forum chairman Klaus Schwab.
Trump has just come into office. Do we think, or I should say, do you think, as we may see this differently, do you think that Trump is somebody who has the elite view of like, hey, the right people are in power, let's make these decisions for everybody else? Or do you believe that he actually sits outside of that system and is actually trying to help the everyday person in the way that he presented himself while he was campaigning?
Yeah, so as far as my perspective on Trump goes, it tends to do with the view, it tends to revolve around the view that he is a businessman at heart, and that the focus of his political style, I guess, is deal making. And, I wrote a lot in my book about Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, who was, among other things, the general counsel to McCarthy during the McCarthy hearings. He was also, a New York City lawyer that represented a lot of unsavory figures, including some tied to organized crime, and also had the ear of Ronald Reagan and top politicians in the United States, and sort of bridged a variety of worlds. And he very much essentially taught Trump the art of the deal, as it were. And, a lot of his Cohn's close associates, like the Pope family, for example, were very politically connected, also connected to organized crime, arguably, but were very much in the business of making backroom deals.
When I hear Roy Cohn's name, that's the first red flag for me. Cohn wasn't just Trump's mentor. He was McCarthy's general counsel during the Red Scare trials, NYC mob-connected lawyer, indicted figures, Reagan-era access. He literally taught Trump how power actually works in the United States. Backroom, off-book, no paper trail. That sounds less like help the everyday person campaign promise and more like I know who to call.
And that's how, power, political power in the United States functions. And so, fundamentally, I think a lot of what Trump likes to focus on and promote about his political style is around negotiations, whether those are diplomatic negotiations or negotiations with businessmen that lead to big number investments he can tout to the public, which is, I think part of the impetus behind his having the Project Stargate press conference, at the White House on his first full day, at his second term. And I think that's also kind of consistent with what we saw from Trump during his first term as well. So when you're sort of focused on those metrics, I don't necessarily think that the focus is necessarily on how do I help everyday Joe. I'm sure that, in his mind, I don't really necessarily want to speak for him, but if you're, of the opinion that I'm going to tout this big multi-million-dollar investment in U.S. AI infrastructure, for example, perhaps he views that as helpful for the American economy and thus helpful for the American people. And I think it is very likely that over the next 4 years, there certainly will be some Americans that economically benefit, from Trump's economic policy. But I don't necessarily think that's going to be everybody. And I think, generally, based on what we've seen so far, there's been a lot of courting of big tech executives and a lot of talk about making the U.S. the AI and crypto capital of the world. And how much of that is necessarily going to translate or trickle down to sort of refer to, Reaganite economic terms.
What I hear Whitney laying out here is really simple. Trump's political ATM is the announcement, not the impact. Stargate. AI infrastructure investment numbers, touted to base as winning, courting big tech CEOs as a campaign strategy. The conversation is about how big the number sounds, not about how it reaches everyday Americans. Reagan-era trickle-down rhetoric. Same language, same problem. Benefits don't necessarily reach the bottom. Public discussion of cognitive diminishment from AI dependency, off the radar entirely. Let's see where the next segment takes this.
To the everyday American public, it's really hard to know. But again, I just want to go back to someone like Eric Schmidt, for example, who, as I noted earlier, had sort of an outsized role in developing the AI policy of the military and intelligence community. He wrote a book called The Age of AI with Henry Kissinger, and also, I believe, a professor from MIT, who, I'm sorry, his name escapes me at the moment, but basically that book posited that essentially AI is going to make a two-tiered society. There's going to be the top tier of people who develop and maintain AI and set and determine what its objective functions are, and then sort of a second class who, which we would assume is larger than the first class, so they don't explicitly say that, but who AI acts upon, and eventually that group will lose the ability to understand and really be able to conceive of how AI is impacting their lives, and will develop some sort of dependency on AI for things like decision making, sort of leading to this phenomena that they refer to in the book as cognitive diminishment, which I sort of see as this idea of, we've all heard it before, if you don't use it, you lose it. Sort of the idea of like mental math, you start using a calculator or a phone calculator or something like that, and it becomes more difficult over time, and eventually very difficult to be able to do mental math in your head, when perhaps when you were in grade school, it was much easier to do that because you had to use that ability regularly. And so they essentially argue that by not making those decisions and outsourcing that to AI, this particular class will lose the ability to make those decisions over time. And when you also factor in that there's a lot of effort to sort of outsource creativity, art and music, to artificial intelligence, will that have an impact on people's ability to create, and what sort of impact will this have on society? And, these are things that I think sort of get left out of the public discussion, and I don't think they're really on someone like Trump's radar as a businessman. He's focused on sort of the bottom line, the number, the success of the negotiation, and how successful it looks, frankly, whether it's to his base or to businessmen he wants to court, or, other people, foreign leaders, and, I'll stop there, I guess.
This is the most underdiscussed part of the entire AI debate, and almost nobody in mainstream media is reporting on it. Schmidt plus Kissinger's book argues for a literal two-tier society, the AI designers plus maintainers on top, the rest of us on the bottom. The bottom tier loses the ability to understand how AI affects their lives. Cognitive diminishment, mental math analogy straight from the book, and if we outsource creativity plus art plus music to AI too, same dependency loop. Trump's not on this radar. Bottom line mindset. That's the alarm bell quietly chiming, and nobody in his cabinet is going to ring it.
No, that was great. So how do you feel when you hear about AI creating this two-tier system?
Oh, I certainly don't think that's positive. I think it's sort of the technocratic model that we discussed earlier, where you sort of have an elite class that sort of set, the system that will micromanage the masses at the end of the day. I mean, they don't explicitly say that in the book, but if you're familiar with someone like Henry Kissinger, for example, and some of his more controversial views on the masses and the public, and some of his more infamous quotes, is that a system that he wants to happen? I don't really know. He's dead, and so no one can ask him. But I think it is kind of disturbing in a sense that someone
What are some of his more infamous quotes? I'm not super familiar with Kissinger. I know who he is, but I couldn't quote him.
Well, he created a national security memorandum, for example, that viewed people that live in the third world birth rates and in the global South as national security threats to the United States, and wanted to implement policies to reduce their population size, for example. Whoa. And sort of had what I would argue is a eugenicist bent to some of his policies. And he was one of the mentors, of course, to people that have become infamous in recent years, like the World Economic Forum chairman Klaus Schwab. Some of his more infamous quotes that he's known for refer to, soldiers being, pawns of foreign policy, essentially sort of like, people's lives are just, pawns on a chessboard for the sort of the elite figures to move around, for their benefit. That's sort of the mentality as I see it of someone like him. But obviously he's been, praised as a model statesman and all of this stuff, and has mentored Trump in his first administration, mentored Hillary Clinton, people on both sides of the aisle. But I personally, I think the more you look into someone like that and his connections with sort of dubious oligarchs like David Rockefeller going, significantly back in time, he's sort of someone that promotes this idea of a global technocracy.
For me, this last segment is the most chilling, because Whitney doesn't speculate. She reads Kissinger's own national security memorandum to me. Third world birth rates labeled as national security threats, policies to reduce population sizes, a eugenicist bent, in her words, soldiers as pawns on a chessboard, people's lives moved around for elite benefit. And then she connects the lineage. Kissinger mentored Klaus Schwab, WEF chairman, and David Rockefeller. That mentor tree didn't disappear. It's the same DNA shaping Trump's AI policy right now. The two-tier system, the cognitive diminishment, the global technocracy. It's not a theory. It was an agenda. It still is.